Hey everyone, how are you? I'm Dilshad Ali. Welcome to the American Muslim Poll 2025 webinar. We're just going to give it a few minutes and we'll get things going around 12:01. So just hang tight and we'll get started in like 2 minutes. Okay, we're at 12:01, so we'll get going then. Hello everyone. Once again, I'm Dilshad Ali. I'm a longtime journalist and editor, freelancer for the last few years, covering Muslims in America, Muslims around the world, and religion stories in general for a variety of media outlets. And I am very honored to be here today moderating this webinar. I've attended this webinar in my journalism capacity many times when they've released other polls, and there's always good things that come out of it. I want to welcome our attendees, and I want to tell you first that this event is being brought to you by the Religion News Association and the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And our speakers, our panelists today will be Selod, who is the co-author of the American Muslim Poll 2025, and Youssef Chouhoud, who is the analyst of ISPU's 2025 American Muslim Poll. Now, a couple of housekeeping items. This poll is embargoed until October 21st, October 21st at 8 a.m. So the information shared in this webinar cannot be published until that time. So again, that's October 21st at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And with that, I think we can get started with the presentation of the findings. So I am going to throw it over to Saher.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Religious News Association for collaborating with ISPU on this event and for having me today to discuss our latest findings from the American Muslim Poll 2025 Evolving Electorate Enduring Challenges. And thank you, Dilshad, for moderating this panel today. So a little bit about ISPU. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding is a secular and nonpartisan research organization. ISPU provides objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. You can see here we have a lot of reports on this slide. We produce rigorous solution-seeking studies on Muslim Americans. It is community-focused. We are connected to academic, national, and local networks. And so I just wanted to highlight the breadth of the studies that we do at ISPU. In the last few years, we've done an election survey of Muslims in swing states. We've done a study on improving Islamic schools and even one on Native American and Indigenous Muslim stories. But today I'm here to talk to you about our latest American Muslim poll. After the 2024 presidential election and second inauguration of President Donald Trump, ISPU conducted our 7th American Muslim poll. The genocide in Gaza, as declared by the International Association of Genocide Scholars in August of 2025, and the attacks on American students protesting created a challenging new environment for American Muslims who experienced heightened censorship and skyrocketing Islamophobia. We also saw increased civic engagement and organizing via the uncommitted movement movement during the presidential primaries. This survey provides an update on the demographic profile of American Muslims last collected in ISPU's 2022 poll. Included in the survey is also the general population, as well as oversampling of Muslims and Jews who are underrepresented religious groups in the United States. So I'm just going to describe our team very quickly. I am the co-author and the co-study PI along with Dalia Mogahed, who is an ISPU scholar, also the former director of research at ISPU. We have a wonderful team, a research team that did a tremendous amount of work on this study. And we worked with NORC this year for the first time ever. NORC is at the University of Chicago. They conduct research and analysis that decision makers trust. As a nonpartisan research organization and a pioneer in measuring and understanding the world, NORC has studied almost every aspect of the human experience and every major news event for more than 8 decades. So they've conducted polling for the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, Stanford, and the National Institute on Aging. A little bit about the methodology. All participants were given an identical survey. As I stated before, we oversampled Muslims and Jews, so we had 800 Muslims and 428 Jews in the sample. And then you can see the breakdown of all the other religious groups. The survey was fielded between April and May of 2025. We also have, we hold ourselves to the highest standards of research methodology. We had, a ton of advisors who are experts in their field, including Dr. Chouhoud, who is our research analyst, who is joining us today to take part of the conversation. So I wanted to start with a little bit on some of the findings. The demographic context of Muslim Americans is important to understand. We know that American Muslims are one of the most ethnically and racially diverse religious groups in the United States. Of all the religious and non-religious groups we surveyed, Muslims were the only group without a majority from a single racial or ethnic background. The plurality of Muslims identify as Black or African American at 28%, 24% identify as Asian, 20% as white, 12% as Arab, 9% identify as Latino or Hispanic, and less than 1% of Muslims identify as Native American or Indigenous. We are one of the only surveys to distinguish between Arab and white, which we can post in the chat about who white Muslims are. As previously reported in 2017 and 2022, American Muslims are younger than all other religious and non-religious groups. Roughly 1/4 in the United States are between the ages of 18 and 24. So this is much larger than all the other groups we see here. It means that Muslims are more likely to be active in the workforce. It also means that this is a population that is expected to grow because there is a large proportion in their childbearing years. And also it means that a large percentage of American Muslims are growing up in a post 9/11 era where their religious community has frequently faced scrutiny, securitization, and discrimination. Half of Muslims are students, more likely than all other groups. So we have 47% of Muslims reported being a current student. This is more likely than 12% of Jews, 15% of Catholics, and 11% of the general public. So just to note, this is students we define as somebody who's in a 4-year degree program, graduate school, a 2-year associate's program, or technical training. But this also is very important to understand their experiences in this moment. Muslims are more likely than most other groups to rate religion as important to their daily life. At 89%, Muslims said it was important to their daily life, only to be beaten by white evangelicals at 97%. They were the ones who reported it at a higher rate. But you can see here that it's greater than 44% of Jews and 72% of Catholics. Muslims are among the most likely to attend religious services once a week at 44%. Again, it was white evangelicals at 59% who stated that they attended, were at a higher rate of attending religious services. And just to note, we found in the report that this is across all age groups, of Muslims stating that they attend religious services frequently. But now I want to turn to Muslim voters. This is probably some of the most important and interesting findings that we have out of this poll. American Muslims are engaging more with the electoral process. Muslim voter registration has steadily been increasing, and efforts by Muslim civic organizations in the 2020 presidential election via the Get Out the Vote campaigns can be seen in higher voter turnout of American Muslims. So here you can see that more Muslims were registered to vote than in 2016, really showing that those efforts to get Muslims organized to vote. It's important to note that their registration level was on par with 2022 at 81%, but that we see a big increase from 2016. Yet, even with Muslims voter registration rising, we see that Muslims are the most likely group to face obstacles in voting in 2024. 37% of Muslims stated that they experienced obstacles to voting more likely than faith and non-faith groups. And the two most cited reasons were long waits and intimidation by private citizens at the polls. But it's important to talk about this election because it got a lot of media attention. Muslim voters were in the spotlight during the 2024 election, even though they are a small percentage of the US population, somewhere between 1% to 2%. There are enough Muslims to determine presidential elections in key swing states. So, for example, in 2020 in Georgia and Pennsylvania, the election came down to a few thousand votes where we saw large numbers of Muslims coming out to vote. So as a result of this, Muslims received, and even after the election, continued to receive a lot of attention on how they were voting. So you can see here that we found that 50% of Muslims stated that they voted for Kamala Harris, similar to the general public. 31% said they voted for Donald Trump, which is less than the general public at 45%. And Muslims had the highest number, Jill Stein had the highest support from Muslims at 12%. It was less than 1% from the general public that said that they voted for third party. It's important to look at how, Muslim votes are changing over time. So among Muslims who voted for Biden in 2020, only 55% said they voted for Harris in 2024. We see that of these, 10% voted for Trump, 16% voted for somebody else, and 19% did not vote for a president. So not shown here, but among the general public, 79% of those who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 reported voting for Kamala Harris in 2024 in comparison. In terms of Trump voters, we see that Trump voters are sticking with Trump Muslim voters are typically sticking with Trump. So 82% of those Muslims who voted for Trump in 2020 voted for Trump, said they voted for Trump in 2024. Only 1% voted for Harris, 1% voted someone else, and 16% said they did not vote for a president in this election. So it's important to note that it was the Muslim Democrats Muslim voters who voted for Biden in 2020. We see more shift occurring. For those Muslims who voted for Trump, we noted that it was 42% were Muslim men versus 17% of Muslim women. So we see a big divide here in terms of gender. And then when we look at this in terms of race of Muslim Trump voters, we see that 76% of Black Muslim voters voted for Harris, and the plurality of white Muslims at 49% voted for Trump. Asian Muslims at 22% were the highest represented group who voted for Jill Stein. So when looking at these third-party voters, for Muslim voters in 2020 who said that they voted for third party, 8% said they voted for Trump, 23% said they voted for a third party or somebody else, and the majority of them at 67% said that they did not vote for a president in this election. Some other points we looked at, what were their policy priorities? And here we show that for all religious groups, the economy ranks as the top priority for all of them. What differs is for Muslims, the war in Gaza is the second highest policy priority, so at 35%. The next highest group is Jews at 10%. For the rest of the religious groups, the second highest priority was either preserving democracy or securing the border. I'm going to turn to civic engagement to talk about how we see that for American Muslims over time. Here you can see for the first time since 2018, the satisfaction for Muslims with the direction of the country has declined. So since 2022, we saw that it dropped from 48% to 23%. The satisfaction is also significantly lower than in 2017, where it was at 41%, and now it's at 23% for Muslims. And yet, despite this decline, American Muslims remain more satisfied with the country's direction than the religiously unaffiliated, less satisfied, though, with the country's direction than white evangelicals. So at 23%, they were on par with the general public, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. Muslims were more likely than most other groups to approve of, were less likely than most other groups to approve of Donald Trump. So in 2025, about 1/5, 21% of American Muslims approved of the way Donald Trump handled his job as president. This is on par with Jews and the non-affiliated. Muslim approval of the president's job has declined sharply since 2022. So you can see 60% in 2022, and it dropped to 21%. And in 2016, it was at the highest at 80%. Now, support for Trump policies. One of the things that we noticed is that the majority of Muslims do not support, they oppose Trump policies. For all Americans, most Trump policies are supported by less than half. But I'm going to show you the breakdown of religious groups and support for Trump policies. So these policies include tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico and China. Just to note that we asked this, at the time, these were the policies that Trump was proposing: termination of DEI mandates, creation of DOJ, expansion of immigration enforcement and ICE, deportation of students who participated in protests, cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, and the recognition of two sexes. For all religious groups, there was less than 50% support for Trump's policies, except white evangelicals, who were over 50% for all, except for two policies, which was cutting Medicare and Medicaid and the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. The other exception was recognizing gender as male and female, where more than half of Muslims, 52%, supported it, as well as 53% of Catholics, 65% of Protestants, and 84% of white evangelicals. Okay, and I'm going to end with talking a little bit about Islamophobia and discrimination. The American Muslim poll this year marks the 5th year that we have calculated the Islamophobia index. It was previously measured in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2022. It measures the level of public endorsement for 5 false negative stereotypes associated with Muslims in America. These are that Muslims are more prone to violence, Muslims discriminate against women, they're hostile to the United States, they're less civilized than other people, and they are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. And here you can see that we see a sharp increase compared to previous years. For white evangelicals, it went up 15 points, for Catholic, 12 points. It was a modest increase for Jews, and for Protestants, it rose 7 points, from 23 in 2022 to 30 in 2025. And just to note, this is on a scale of 0 to 100. We note that Islamophobia in our report is linked to higher support for Trump policies. And also, we note that in our report and in past reports, we've shown that the higher somebody The higher their Islamophobia index score is, the more likely they are to accept military targeting of civilians, greater acceptance of individual targeting of civilians, and greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes. Finally, Muslims are, in this poll, we found they were most likely to experience religious discrimination compared to other groups. It was 63%, with Jews next at 50%. But the frequency of religious discrimination faced by Muslims has remained unchanged since 2016. It's ranged from 59% and now at 63%. And the last slide I'm going to share with you on from this report is that half of Muslims families have a child who has been bullied for their religion. So we're seeing a real spike in the experiences of children and their experiences with being bullied in their schools. So we have more topics we're going to share from the American Muslim poll. I just share the ones in this, few from this report in the interest of time. I'm sorry that we couldn't get through more. Please read the report. But these are the topics that will come out later in 2026, which is interfaith engagement, impacts on caregivers of aging, mental health, and more on student experiences. So I'm going to stop there and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Saher. My journalist hat is buzzing right now, and I have so many questions that have come out of this. One of the things I wanted to start with actually is the methodology of this poll. I know in my previous reporting, one of the things I like to understand best is how a poll is conducted, what makes it rigorous, what makes it unique. So to Yusuf, I'd like to ask about that. Like, what does make this poll rigorous, unique? What's the margin of error? What are some things you can tell us about how this poll was created and conducted?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dilshad. So what makes this poll unique, quite frankly, is that it's something that I'll mention later on as well. It's one of the only instances where we have Muslim attitudes alongside an oversample of American Jews and a sample of the general public as well, which gives us kind of deep insight into kind of the nuances, not just about these communities that often get overlooked, but how do they compare to other communities among the majority public? But what really kind of makes the issue, of course, with any survey is how does it get conducted, and you kind of hinted at that. As Saha mentioned, NORC is the institution that conducted the survey, and they are really kind of the gold standard, honestly, when it comes to conducting surveys for firms, for academic institutions. They are the ones that run the general social survey, again, kind of the gold standard of social science. And they also run the ANES, the American National Election Survey. So they are kind of at the forefront of survey and data collection, and so based on their probability databases as well as their kind of non-probability samples. I mean, sampling American Muslims is hard, sampling American Jews is hard, sampling these low incidence populations are hard. But they have this way of kind of combining both probability and non-probability data sets in order to kind of get at the most unbiased sampling of these communities. And so you can ask the team members at ISPU for confirmation. I was very excited when I heard that NORC was conducting this year's survey. But certainly the previous year's survey were conducted by SSRS, another very highly reputable and well-regarded institution as well. And so, barring a couple $1 million to sample American Muslims, this really is kind of the highest bar, I think, when it comes to data on this community.
And can you remind us how many people were polled, and like across the United States, like geographically speaking,
The how many people were polled like within each state, you mean, or
in totality?
in totality? Well, so the sample itself contains a bit less than 800
Hmm.
American Muslims. has a high number of American Jews as well, and a high percentage of a high number of the general public, over 1,000 respondents there as well. And so these numbers are kind of high enough to say something standalone about these communities. But notably, it gives us a way to kind of measure differences kind of within the communities as well. When you are sampling particularly low incidence communities, oftentimes you'll have samples of maybe like 200, 300, and that's really kind of pulling teeth sometimes. But when you have 700 plus American Muslims, when you have hundreds of American Jews alongside hundreds of the members of the general public as well, that allows you to kind of get at more nuance kind of within these communities, not just kind of compare one to the other.
Okay. And Saher, you obviously just went through a lot of the key findings, but I've read through a lot of the data that has been made available. What to you stands out as some of the most like really interesting, like I didn't expect that to happen kind of findings for 2025 and why?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that probably 50% of Muslims voted for Kamala Harris because we were inundated with news stories about how Muslims were voting third party, some of the, polling that came out right after the election or the day of the election had that number of Jill Stein voters at 50%. And so I think that was something, just given the media cycle that Muslims were really framed as a population that was I want to say being, blamed essentially for the way the election turned out. And so, there was a hyper focus on Dearborn, Michigan, and the way Muslims are voting in Dearborn, Michigan. And what we're able to provide here is an actual nuanced examination of the way Muslims were voting, what their policy priorities are. So the other thing that I think is important and stands out to me about this survey and the data here is that Muslims are not a monolith. They're very diverse. And so, as I showed in that slide, 76% of Black Muslims voted for Kamala Harris. And so, their policy priorities are, for Muslims are very diverse, we see this in the data, but one thing that we see as a unifying factor for Muslims is the genocide and the war in Gaza. That's another takeaway that we see in the data points here. So I think that's one of the things that will surprise most people when they look at this report.
Yusuf, how about you? I'm wondering the same question to you. Like what amongst, the information that has come out of it, what really sticks out to you? Like that was a surprising find, or yeah, that confirms what I thought all along, perhaps.
Yeah, so Sahar mentioned that there was a lot of talk with regards to how high the percentage was among American Muslims that actually voted for a third party for president. And I think when I saw the number in the data that we got from NORC, it just had the most facial validity of any number that I've seen come out with regards to American Muslims. If you kind of do a nerdy deep dive into like the precinct level data among in areas that have high concentrations of Arabs or Muslims. The numbers that you see there, like the hard numbers, just simply don't align with some of the very kind of aggrandized numbers that we saw kind of come out from various sources with regards to the percentage that voted for Jill Stein. And so the around 12% that this survey has just makes a lot of facial
Mm,
validity, just makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
And so that when I saw that, that gave me a lot of kind of comfort and a lot of kind of excitement to kind of see what else we find in a survey.
So we're going to get to our questions from people here in the webinar, but I wanted to touch a little bit about how this poll can be used in reporting for journalists or for policymakers or community leaders? Like what are like some really effective good ways that journalists, policymakers, community leaders can use the information out of this poll for their work? So could you speak to that, Sahara? Like what implications does a poll carry for these groups?
Yeah, I think it provides the data that I think is very necessary for anyone in the news journalists, any media, to look at Muslims in the complexity of which we are. We are not we do our identities are often flattened in the ways in which people report about us. So we're very diverse community. We're very and I think that's the utility of this report is that journalists can go into this report and say, okay, how are African American Muslims? What are their policy priorities? What are, Arab Muslims? What are Muslim men versus Muslim women? I mean, I just showed you a data point that's pretty incredible. 47% of Muslim men were more likely to support Trump's policies versus Muslim women, And that's something that I think is really important to note that, we are a population that you just cannot, narrowly define or narrowly describe. And so to the journalists, I highly recommend looking at the data in here and looking at how diverse this population is and how complex we are. And that way, then when you're reporting on us, I think you'll get it right if we look at Muslims in a more nuanced way.
And how do you think data like this can be used responsibly to avoid stereotypes while informing coverage? I mean, if either one of you have any insight to give on that.
Yeah, I mean, we can go to the Islamophobia index, for example, look at those
Yeah.
measures again. Do we always have to report on Muslims in this, sort of way that Muslims are prone to violence or what have you? Are Muslims more, loyal to another country than this one? I think that's the other thing that you'll see in this report is that Muslims care very deeply about domestic policy. And if you look at our past reports, you're going to see that domestic issues are very important to Muslims. It's just in this context of the war on Gaza, that was, sort of a unique moment for Muslims because of their experiences with speech, their experiences on college campuses. But I think that, refraining from, falling into these pitfalls that we sort of describe in the Islamophobia index of only reporting on us in these sorts of ways. And I don't know, Yusuf, if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that there are ways in which we see kind of heterogeneity kind of within the American Muslim community, and I think that is very useful for journalists. And I think again, kind of the insights that we get kind of within the same survey with regards to kind of comparisons across groups as well. So where American Muslims kind of differentiate from the general public, but where notably they are kind of very much aligned with at least certain segments of the general public as well. Really kind of helps you build a very holistic picture of this community and other communities besides.
Okay. Also, I was curious about if you were going to tell us as journalists, here in in this webinar, and those who will be coming to read about this next week when the embargo is lifted. If you were going to advise us to pay attention to a finding or a trend, what would that be? What would be some good developing stories that journalists should keep an eye on?
I think what for me, one of the ones, and I know I pretty much glossed over it. Maybe there are a couple if I can do two here.
Sure.
One is that I know is very data heavy with lots of percentages on Trump's policies, but what I, didn't go into enough depth or detail on was that when it comes to the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, that is not just a Muslim, that is not supported across the board of all religious groups, non-affiliated, and the general public. That's something that I think, another thing that in the media that like that Gaza was a Muslim, only Muslims. Now, while it was, the second highest policy priority for Muslims, we see that all across the board with other religious groups that this was not is not a popular policy priority at the time of President Trump. So that's something, kind of going to Yusuf's point about we're able to compare how Muslims are viewing something compared to other religious groups in the United States. And that the other thing that I think is very important is that the level of Islamophobia continues to remain the same. So, while, the Islamophobia index increased for other groups, Muslims' experiences with Islamophobia are continuous. Like it's remaining unchanged over time. And this is something that requires attention, that Muslims are continuously facing this. I know that the New York Times are they're reporting on Mamdani and the hot skyrocketing of Islamophobia. We've been
Right.
experiencing this, we're used to experiencing this, and this is something that requires a lot more attention. And I don't know, Yusuf, if you have anything that you want to add.
So I guess the only thing that I would say is that one of the more kind of striking findings, and I kind of hinted at this in the beginning, was that about 12% of American Muslims voted for a third party in the presidential election, compared to, I mean, essentially 0% of the general public, and that divergence is real, but it kind of also needs to be placed in this kind of broader American context. So, as people are kind of going through the report, I very much kind of encourage them to, not be, overly tempted to kind of gauge any particular snapshot that we have of the American Muslim community, particularly in this moment, as indication of a kind of long-term trend. There are these kind of secular forces, secular in the sense of like slow moving, not non-religion, forces kind of working on the American society generally, namely kind of disillusionment with the two-party system overall. But really, when it comes to kind of the salience of foreign policy in this particular moment, that's really where American Muslims kind of stand apart. 35% of American Muslims in the sample that we have put Gaza as a top priority, but among those who voted third party, 80% said Gaza was a top priority.
Yeah.
And so, that is very much kind of hinting at like this particular moment is a kind of disjuncture in the way that American Muslims have kind of typically approached electoral politics. It is important to kind of understand the dynamics of this moment, but not to kind of make too much of it and say that this is kind of indicative of a more kind of near term, midterm, certainly not a long term
Mm.
trend.
Okay, so we're going to move to some audience questions now. Question number one. The gender gap in the shift to Trump seems to follow patterns of marginalized groups and the gender gap. Do you have any additional information that might explain that gap?
Yeah, I think, well, one, we need to think about it's the gender gap is not just with marginalized groups, it's actually with the mainstream as well in the United States, so white Americans as well. We have a younger population in the survey, so certainly we're seeing similar trends among Muslim men, yeah, and particularly, younger Muslim men supporting more of these conservative right-wing policies and leaning towards that. So I think that this is something we need to explore more research-wise, like, where are Muslim young men? What are their, what's important to them? What are their policies? Where are they, what are they doing on social media? Who are they following? Things like that. The other piece of it, and when you have 17% only of Muslim women who are following this, the flip side of that, I think, is that we also need to pay attention to Muslim women and what their policy priorities are. And that across the board, when it comes to any kind of, if you, I'm a former academic, looking at social movements, looking at, those who are advocating for change in a society, a lot of times in this country, it's been women led. And I think that Muslim women are also, perhaps following a similar trend in terms of, not, or being more, perhaps somewhat more liberal on certain policies. And that's something that also requires a lot more research. But I don't think that this is unusual. I think that Muslims are following a broader trend that we're seeing both globally and in the United States of,
Okay.
perhaps younger men following into this. Yeah.
Okay, here's another one from our audience. Can you please elaborate on the ethnic identifications amongst the respondents, specifically whether Arabs, Latinos, and others may have also identified as white in the survey?
Yusuf, do you want to take it? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the ethnic or racial identification of all respondents is self-reported. And so identity is one of these things that we talk about as if it has some fixed objective reality, but it is far more subjective than we perhaps give it credit for. And so somebody with an Arab background, somebody with a Latino background may identify as white, in not just in this survey, but in federal forms, etc. And that is how they would be captured then in this survey. So it's really, what I tend to tell my students, and what I'll also say here is that whenever you see kind of self-reported racial or ethnic data, you should think about this not as their race or ethnicity, but their racial or ethnic identity, how they see themselves effectively, right? And so they may have a background that you may not, as somebody that is not them, kind of would perhaps code them as something other than, what they put down. But this is, really kind of the way that surveys have to work, right? We can't just simply kind of ask about your background and then us ourselves kind of code you as something that perhaps you don't necessarily identify as. Just to give you a quick data point kind of outside of this survey, if you are a Latino who has kind of a lineage that goes back 3 generations or more, about half of them identify as white. So so again, what we're capturing is kind of how you yourself kind of regard yourself in the context of American society, which is kind of places race and ethnicity on a very high pedestal.
Okay.
I could just add one other thing. You can go to our website and see who we think these white Muslims are. We have a piece on that, so it really helps to explain this a little bit more as well.
Yeah, and that piece has been shared in the chat, so you can find it there. I think it's already been shared there twice. The third question is actually one that I have had brewing in my mind, so I'm really excited to ask this of you guys. So, Muslims are the youngest faith group in the US, as shown through this poll, while Jewish and Catholic populations skew much older. How might those age gaps shape the stories that journalists should be following about religion and politics in the years to come? And like, what stories do you see coming out of that?
I think there's a lot that
Yeah.
could be explored, and one of them is, for example, can talk about the rise in Muslim civic organizations that we've seen over the last, decade and a half since 9/11. But, we're seeing a lot more younger Muslims. One, perhaps like getting more involved in, the political realm as career choices. So we saw, I think somebody had a number of like, I think it was 250 Muslims, elected to office, in the last few years. That's a lot more than what we saw even in 2018, where we saw a spike of Muslims running for office. So these are young Muslims who are, perhaps majoring in political science. And, we're seeing now more Muslim civic organizations and advocacy organizations and think tanks and things like that, providing a pipeline for Muslims to become more involved. Because when your identity is under threat, that's what happens is you respond by, trying to do something about it, trying to make that change, whether it's through policy, politics, laws, and whatnot. So I think we're seeing, as I showed, a large student population We're seeing what's happening on college campuses right now. I mean, as you know, I still look at all the reporting coming out of higher ed and things like that. We know there's a demographic cliff coming to, with a smaller student population, but yet Muslims are going to grow. The Muslim population is going to grow. So I think there's a lot that you can really start to explore in terms of Muslim civic engagement, student experiences, and whatnot, years to come.
Yeah. Okay, another question. And again, this is one that I have been seeing in my listening and reporting since the election last year. Would you anticipate seeing similar rates of third party voting in the Muslim community going forward? Or do you think that was perhaps an anomaly tied to this specific situation right now with Gaza, knowing the fact that, there's a tentative ceasefire on the table now?
I think that it really comes down to who the Democrats kind of nominate
Yeah.
for the 2028 election. And the reason that I say that is because, as Saha showed during the presentation, the exodus from the from the main two party candidates primarily came from the Democratic side.
Mhm.
And so, if the Democrats continue to think that, kind of business as usual is going to kind of suffice for keeping this community. Obviously, they have other considerations in mind, but speaking specifically about American Muslims, I don't think there will be much taste for kind of full-throatedly, wholeheartedly supporting a Democratic candidate who doesn't at least want to change the relationship with Israel, let alone one who wants to kind of maintain or perhaps strengthen ties between America and Israel, given everything that we've seen. But that said, though, I mean, that's just kind of like at the establishment wing, right? When we think about, where American Muslims feel at home, yeah, there's a lot of disillusionment right now. But when we think about, what is giving American Muslims hope? I mean, the candidates are primarily still in the Democratic Party. I mean, you can look at Abdul El Sayed over at Michigan, obviously Zohar Mamdani over in New York. And so these are, and to kind of the previous question as well, what are the stories that may be more in line with American Muslims giving their youth? Well, like when we talk about kind of the next generation of Democratic leaders, I think a disproportionate percentage of them are probably going to come out of the American Muslim community as they, are encouraged to kind of step up and take those leadership roles.
Yeah, and I'm
Okay.
I'm just going to add a little if that's okay too.
Yeah,
I
please.
think because the question is, are we seeing American Muslims moving to the third party,
Right.
and if you saw that slide, those who voted third party in 2020, the majority did not vote third party in 2024. So and also if you take a deeper dive into the report and look at, Muslim policy priorities, where Muslim fall, they're not necessarily falling into this progressive, sort of bucket that they're all going third party. But to what Yusuf said, they're going to vote based on, who's going to recognize them and recognize what issues matter to them. And it's very important to note that slide that showed Islamophobia has remained unchanged. Those are under Democratic and Republican presidents. So,
Right.
in this particular moment where you had a Democratic president, and you saw a spike, people were coming out and reporting higher levels of experiences with discrimination and hate crimes, that was happening under a Democratic president. And I think that's something that Muslims are saying, well, if you don't care about us, we won't vote for you. And so, but
Right.
it's not necessarily that they're moving to a third party like other groups we've seen, might look at who are third party, voters, whatnot.
Okay. Another question that has come. When comparing Muslims to other faith groups, which cross-group differences or similarities surprised you the most this year with this poll?
So this wasn't necessarily a surprise, just given, that I've been so ensconced in this data, but could potentially be a surprise for, others who are perhaps new to the American Muslim poll, or are looking for data that really kind of speaks to this moment. And what I'm referring to here is the data on discrimination and how American Muslims and American Jews really do tend to cluster
Mhm.
on issues of discrimination. So, Muslims and Jews really kind of stand apart, right? So 63% of Muslims and 50% of Jews reported experiencing faith-based discrimination in the past year, compared to only around a quarter of Catholics, Protestants, or evangelicals. And nearly half of Muslim families reported that their child was bullied for religion, which is, again, kind of more than double the rate of Catholics or Protestants. And when you look at the Islamophobia index, it shows something of a similar pattern, right? So Muslims and Jews tend to cluster at the low end, and this is, across multiple waves. They're joined there quite often with the non-affiliated as well. And it's really, especially this year with a bit of an uptick, Catholics and white evangelicals that are really at the higher end of that scale. So the kind of continuity when it comes to issues of discrimination, with regards to American Muslims and American Jews, in terms of shared experiences, but in terms of how they look at discrimination towards the other, I think is really notable and kind of sets them apart. I think from a number of the kind of majority religious groups in the country.
Okay. Um, what do you think is the most meaningful long-term trend uh, that is coming out of this data versus what might be a short-term fluctuation?
I think there are two things that are important. One is going back to the Islamophobia experiences with discrimination that we're seeing that remain relatively unchanged. That's data that we're able to compare to past years, and I think it's important to really highlight that because 63% is high. That is a
Yeah,
very high percentage. 59% is high, you
yeah.
know. So that's one that I think we need to keep our eye on. I think the other one is that we've been talking about it, but maybe saying it in a different way, is that Muslim votes are sort of up for grabs right now. As you're
Mhm.
thinking about the midterm election, this is a population that you can win votes over with if you start paying attention to them, but paying attention to what their policy issues are, what their priorities are, and acknowledging what their experiences have been. So to me, those are the two that even I think we're showing that Muslim votes are really, it may feel like this moment, but I think this is a trend that we're going to start seeing moving forward as well.
Yeah, I had seen that in my reporting as well. Not only just the fact that the votes are up for grab, but also if a candidate is able to solidify those votes and then not follow through as they serve out their term, that Muslims are paying attention. It's one thing I've seen in my reporting. Okay, another question that has been brewing in my head that has come from our audience. Some of these findings, especially around younger, more diverse Muslim populations, seems like the story of a generational change. So, what questions should journalists be asking about how this younger generation might reshape American religious life more broadly?
That's a good question. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
You guys have young adults in your home? Because I do, and this question comes up a lot.
uh,
you want to try it, Yusuf, or you want me to go?
I mean, I guess just one thing that I would kind of pin is that younger American Muslims, and I haven't yeah, now that I think about it, I haven't double checked on the most recent data, but I mean, typically what we've seen is that younger American Muslims are tend to be far more religious and kind of sustainably religious, on various measures of religiosity, more so than their kind of counterparts in that same kind of age cohort. And so how long does that kind of sustain, both in terms of kind of generational cohort and age cohort? And how does that kind of shift our kind of anticipated kind of based on kind of historical data, what we anticipate, for a certain kind of age group, from a certain kind of background, how they kind of move through American kind of political existence. I mean, if they really are kind of sticking to their religiosity kind of as they age and kind of through these various kind of life stages, I think that really does get make them a kind of unique cohort to kind of follow kind of through the years. So that's just something that I think is worth paying attention to.
And I'll just add the other thing to look at is how are they changing American Muslim life in the United States? That's something that we don't have that in the report, but these are questions that should be generated from this data. So, I mean, they're younger, so just anecdotally noticing that there's more content on social media for them. They're changing the ways in which Islam is being, engaged with in the United States because they're younger. And so these are questions that I think that journalists should be looking at. That's not the same as the first generation immigrant Muslims or even the African American Muslims who have, grown up with many have grown up or reverted or converted to Islam. So these are some things that I think we should be paying attention to. How is it changing the way in which Islam is being practiced in the United States?
Yeah, I think you both have made some really strong points there, and especially I've been thinking a lot around what you Yusuf said about how religiosity may look like with this younger generation. How are they practicing now, and how will they continue to practice as they age versus how, immigrant generations or first gen generations, how they practice and what were their priorities. I think those are real all interesting things to keep an eye on. We're at the 12:55 p.m. mark, so we have about 5 minutes to wrap up, but I'm going to slide one more question in there. Um, Gaza was a much higher policy priority for Muslim voters compared to any other group. Do you see parallels in how other international conflict situations become defining political issues for other faiths?
I mean, that's an interesting question that I'm not sure I can totally answer,
Yeah.
because I think, Gaza's just it's very different for the American Muslim population. Part of that is because there's been a history of silencing around this issue for
Yeah.
as long as I remember, being in an academic setting, that we've always known. And this is and this is the moment where people have actually been, speaking out very publicly. I think it would be interesting to look at what connections do other religious groups have to other international conflicts like this.
Yeah.
Like where are there, but for Muslims, because of the significance of this, of Palestine and religiously the significance, I think this really resonates with an American Muslim population in a very different way. So I don't really have the answer to that question. I don't know, Yusuf,
Yeah,
if
it's
you.
a hard one. I just wanted
Yeah,
to slide it in there, though. I know it's a hard one. I am going to wrap it up now. I'm going to share some key findings. I wish we could go on for another half an hour because personally, I have a bunch of more questions I'd like to ask, but I'll leave those for future stories. Some of the key findings that I want to make sure that we remember from this report. So, vote choice in 2024. Half of Muslims supported Kamala Harris, 31% supported Donald Trump, and 12% supported Jill Stein, which was the highest Stein support of any group. And as noted in some of our questions, Muslim women were far less likely than men to support Trump, which was 17% versus 42%. The other big thing was the shift of Muslim votes. So among Muslims who voted in 2020 and in 2024 presidential elections, 55% who voted for Biden in 2020 um, voted for Harris in 2024, and 82% who voted for Trump in 2020 also voted for him in 2024. And as we all ascertain the policy priorities, Muslims were uniquely influenced by both economic concerns at 41% and the war in Gaza at 35%, compared to just 4% of the general public naming Gaza as a priority. And something that I thought was really notable, Islamophobia is on the rise, tracked since 2018. According to ISPU's Islamophobia Index, rose from 25 in 2022 to 33 among general public in 2025, with the sharpest increases among white and Hispanic Americans. And discrimination is widespread. 63% of Muslims report experiencing religious discrimination in the past year, which is the highest of any group. So, those are some notable key findings, but if you take the time to delve through the entirety of the report, when it comes to you later today, you'll find a plethora of really interesting findings and facts, from which I think a lot of really interesting stories come forth. It can be helpful in policy making and so on and so forth. So I would like to thank the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and the Religion Newswriters Association and our speakers today, Saher Selod and Youssef Chouhoud. And I thank them for inviting me to moderate this panel. It's been a really great experience. And a reminder again that the information from this poll is embargoed until 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, October 21st. After which time, please have at it and get your interviews in there and get your stories going because there's a lot to learn from this poll. I thank you very much and appreciate everyone who signed up and showed up, and for everyone who's going to be watching the recording later on. Thanks again.